Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the sixth in the Greenwich Industrial History Society's pandemic series of online lectures. I'm Alan Birkett-Gray and I'm Secretary of the Society, and I'd like to thank so much to Mary Mills, who's our co-chair and is with us tonight. She's put together our excellent lecture programme. We started in October 2020 after lockdown started more or less a year ago today. March the 16th, 2020 was my last day out in central London before we all locked down. Since October, we've covered the history of the Greenwich Peninsula, thanks to Mary, the tunnels under Maidenstone Hill, the role of Greenwich and this whole area in the history of international communications, which led directly to the internet, and back underground, the long continuous thread from Bazalgette in the Victorian era to the Thames Tideway Tunnel today. You can see all of these on our channel on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com and search for Greenwich Industrial History. And you will find all 5 lectures so far, and the sixth will be there as well, probably by the end of the week. Now, next month, to give you a bit of advance warning, we'll be heading a little bit west of Greenwich to New Cross, to the old Hatcham Ironworks, where there was a locomotive factory. And some of those locomotives can still be seen on the Festiniog Railway. Father Kevin, who's a local Catholic priest, will be telling us all about that. Keep an eye on our Facebook group. Go to Facebook and search for Greenwich Industrial History, and you will find the site that Mary's been running for years, long before anybody ever heard of COVID. Thanks, Mary, again for all your hard work. And if you tell me you don't do Facebook, please recognise this is where we are now. This is the future. You're watching this talk on Zoom, or if you're watching a recording, you're watching on YouTube. We've had probably twice or 3 times as many people as ever crammed into the old bakehouse in Blackheath Village. And on the YouTube audience figures, they're huge. Mary's talk on the Greenwich Peninsula has had almost 350 views on YouTube so far. Mine on Subsea Telecoms, 335 so far. That's altogether across the 5 talks we've had, 1,074 views of our talks on YouTube. This is going to be how our societies, such as ours, conduct our business in the future. We've even had some people turn down our invitations to talk because they say they want to wait until we have real life talks again. Don't kid yourselves. These are real life talks. Zoom isn't going to go away. And tonight, let's get to tonight. We have a real archaeologist. Welcome to Mark Stevenson, who's the archaeological advisor to the borough. He's going to be talking to us about sites from the recent past, current sites, and as sites soon to see, archaeologists hard at work, including, I trust, the Greenwich's medieval tide mill. And just to emphasise my earlier point, Mark is in Bedford. He's talking to us without having to wait on cold platforms on London Bridge and Blackheath on the way home. We're listening to him without making our way to the old bakehouse on a cold March evening. So before I hand over to Mark, can you please make sure your mics are muted and your cameras turned off? If you want to ask a question, you're welcome to do so. Please go to the link in the middle of the bottom of your screen. After Mark's finished, he'll be answering questions. So right, that's enough from me. Welcome to Mark, and please, can you go ahead, Mark?
Thank you very much, Alan. I'll just check that you can hear me fine, Alan.
We can, and I can see you as well.
Okay, and therefore
I love your background. Tell us about your background.
That's the view from the office window, which I last saw, like you, a year ago today was my last commute.
Yeah.
So let me start the slide.
Now I've got your PowerPoint. Thank you.
Right. Is that full screen?
Perfect.
Okay, so there we go. That's the first screen. So I'll be talking about a range of sites across the borough this evening. And so we're trying to cram in a lot of visits on our nighttime whistle-stop tour of Greenwich, looking at sites that were done a few years ago, sites that are very much up and running at the moment, and sites which are soon to start. So things to keep your interest going over the coming year. But first of all, what is Historic England? Who are we? Well, we are a subvention. We receive a subvention from the Department for Digital Culture, Media, and also Sport. And we
You've been watching
I
that
always,
comedy program, yes.
I always slip that in.
Yeah.
I always slip that in. So we're part of the Department for Digital Culture, Media, and also Sport. And we are the government's advisor on historic environment. And you've probably seen a lot in the papers about high street regeneration programs, specifically of late. Since 2015, we've split the organisation into two. The English Heritage remains as an independent charity looking after the sites and collections, and Historic England remains in-house and provides the planning and government advice and conservation archiving service, etc., to the government and the wider sector. And there are a number of shared services that we have, such as IT and admin and so on to a certain degree. So that's how we operate. And obviously through the commissioners, we are answerable to the Secretary of State at DCMS. So the Trust, as I say, looks after the collections and properties. And for the Historic England part of the operation, the office, which is based on the 4th floor at Cannon Bridge House in this location here, looks after 4 areas of work. Development management, that's the listed buildings, particularly, and conservation area work. Historic places looks after the wider policy areas, conservation areas, and other such designations. We also, from this office, run the Heritage at Risk, which compiles an annual list of properties and sites that are at particular risk from harm or neglect. And then we have the non-statutory archaeological advice. Elsewhere in the country, that advice is usually given by the unitary authorities for those locations through the county archaeologist or district councils. But in London, the situation is a little bit different for historic reasons. And we have a small team of people, myself being one, who provides the non-statutory archaeological advice to 31 of the 33 London boroughs. By non-statutory, I mean that alongside me sits the Inspector of Ancient Monuments, who looks after the monuments that are designated as being nationally important across London. So I deal with all the other archaeology that is not so designated, and therefore the vast majority of archaeology across London passes through our fingers in that way. So just to give you a context, we have a small group of colleagues, and my area is the area in green, so covering all the way along the Thames from Wandsworth down to the Derwent at Bexley. Southwark and City have their own in-house archaeologists working within their respective planning authorities. But the other 31 boroughs come to our office to gain their archaeological advice in respect of planning applications and how to proceed with those sites. So tonight, what I want to do is to scamper through a number of sites across Greenwich Borough. As you'll see, they're all pretty much along the Thames, the northern part of the borough. I mean, we could look at areas such as Eltham, for example, but that would be perhaps another talk, another day, to give that proper justice to the archaeology and the heritage that's represented in that area of the borough. So what I want to do is, and they're only in particular order from west to east. So we're looking at Greenwich Park, Greenwich Wolff, Peninsula, Woolwich Arsenal, Macbean Street, Spray Street, Pettenham Crescent development sites, and then looking at Thamesmead to finish off the evening, if we have any breath left at the end of our marathon cycle ride through the dark. So let's start with the World Heritage Site of Greenwich Park. The Greenwich Park is here, and the old medieval palace site is in this location up against the River Thames. The Thames is just to the north here. The area was given to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and his wife Eleanor in 1433, and they enclosed the park and also built a palace against the Thames at that time, building the palace 1443. The palace languished, but it was then in 1500 or thereabouts that extensive rebuilding work was undertaken by Henry VII, with the result that the palace was favoured by the Tudors, and Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and Queen Mary were all born within that palace. The Queen's House, which is located here, is pivotal to the site. Can you see the cursor there, Alan? As you can see my
yes,
cursor.
I can. Yes, I can.
Excellent.
Yep,
Okay,
yep.
that's where the Queen's House is. Designed by Indigo Jones, started in 1616 under King James I for his wife Anne of Denmark, but they only got as far as the first floor construction before she died, alas, in 1619, and so it was left to King Charles I for his wife Henrietta Maria, and work then continued in 1635. So that's an important consideration for the layout of the park that then came, because during this period of enlightenment, with the establishment of the observatory up on this location, eventually up here, we had the setting out of a formal garden in front of the Queen's House, and that was the first time that we'd seen that style of housing for nobility, with also a formal garden being set out with it. And it's this site that set the pattern for all the country estates that you see around the country today. This is where that trend started. But for the moment, let me take you up the hill into this area of the park, which is the area where the Roman temple site is. This is the area here. You can see Maze Hill Gate is just up to the north of the site. Until a few years ago, you had a small area in the middle of the site which was fenced, with a small patch of cemented mosaic in the middle of it, which didn't make much sense. We had a signboard added to try and illuminate the visitor, but it was still not an ideal situation to have. But anyway, the interest in this site started at the beginning of the 20th century, with excavations being undertaken, and they established that there was two main phases to the development, but they clearly identified that there was a temple here rather than a Roman farmstead of some description. So that was an important milestone that was achieved. We then had the Southwark and Lambeth Archaeological Excavation Committee excavate here in the late 1970s, and they confirmed the earlier results that the site was represented by two phases of building work during the first and fourth centuries. And geophysical survey carried out in 1994 was quite useful, but didn't actually cover the entire footprint of the building and its enclosure. And it was the Time Team excavation from 1999 that extended our understanding of this site. And in fact, you may recall, those who remember the program, discovering this fragment of inscription to Jupiter and the spirits of the emperors, it clearly demonstrating beyond doubt that the site was a dedicated temple. This is the site that one would expect to see, some outbuildings within an enclosure, and the temple site at one end of that location. And so we wanted to improve the understanding of the visitors to see this site. And so we were able to use the 2012 Olympics and all the preparatory work that was undertaken for the equestrian events that were held here to improve the setting and location of this Roman temple site, so that we had the 1970s excavation trenches properly backfilled, so you couldn't trip into them. We also took the railings down on top there and removed the information, had a new information board put up on the edge here to demonstrate that it's the entire area that is the monument, not just the small area on top of the mound. And that works very well. The site had been scheduled in December 2009, so it's quite a new designation. It's not an old historic designation, so it's interesting it's taken that while before it did become scheduled. The big thing that's going to be happening now, which I am hoping that many of you will be involved with in some measure over the coming few years, an 8 million budget has been secured to be spent over 4 years, and it's the Greenwich Park Revealed project, being coordinated by the Royal Parks. What I'll quickly run through are a few of the key elements that this project will involve. We've been working very closely with Royal Parks over a number of years in putting this programme together and suggesting elements to be included within it. So I'm pleased to say that that all that is now coming to fruition. It's been delayed a little bit because of the usual situation that we're all in at the moment, but the key elements is to look at the restoration of the grand steps, which I'll talk about in a moment, improve the setting of the Wolff statue. Millions of visitors come to Greenwich Park each year, and they all stand in the area around the statue, but that experience needs to be improved, and so this programme will enable that to happen. And also the tree avenues. A lot of the trees are showing signs of stress and disease. Many of the species are not sustainable in the long term and are deteriorating. And a lot of the avenues are of mixed varieties rather than of one particular variety. So there's clearly a need for a programme to manage the tree estate. So where you've got an avenue of trees, do you just replace one at a time? Do you replace an entire avenue? Where you've got pairs of rows of avenues on flanking each side, do you replace a row at a time? Or so all that is being measured within this programme, which is obviously going to take many years to complete. But there is a programme in place now to seize the legacy of the park maintained. So the giant steps is the pivotal feature in the whole landscape that relates back to the Queen's House. You can see the Queen's House sitting centre stage here. From the top of the statue, you can see that it's not exactly a pretty sight, with the chestnut fencing here, try and deter people from walking down the slope. You can see the worn pathways already there. You can't see that there were historic steps there that were designed to be there as part of the landscaping for the Queen's House. You can't see that at all. And if you look back in the top photograph, you can see this picture I took a few years ago from the balcony of the Queen's House. You can't see the steps at all. You don't realise that there is a formal landscape that's been set out for your viewing from the Queen's House at all. So the visitors don't see that at all, and yet that is one of the nationally important features that we have within the park. You can see an early 19th century illustration showing people doing what people do today, running up and down, or even rolling down the hill, or tobogganing if it's snowing. The some of the avenues of trees were set out by Borman in the early days before Le Notre was brought in to add to the formality of the design, bringing in French styles, which you can see here. The idea being to bring in water as well and have cascades. That was one of the grand ideas, and you can see that in the quotes here. But this is one of the illustrations to show what the idea was to have these series of steps running down the slope, which would have had other potentially water features and at a later stage added, but that never happened. But you can already see the young trees already been planted for the main axes around the Greenwich Park area to formalise this landscape. We have studied closely LiDAR images, photographs taken from the air using digital equipment, whereby you're looking at reflected points of data coming back to produce a modelling of the landscape. And you can see a bit of the terracing showing here, but you can see how eroded the whole landscape is. There's a very thin soil here, so it wouldn't have stayed in its pristine state for long before it started to erode in this manner. Detailed surveys have been undertaken to map out the existing surfaces, and the bottom here is a cross section along this red line to show you can't really see those steps at all now. The only one you can see is this wider platform midway up. So you have had a series of steps on the lower slope, then a terrace, and then more steps going up to the top. And we've lost all the detail, the finer nuance of that. But you can see the width of the steps quite clearly, so we can see the measure of that. The later insertion of this pathway that you climb up to the observatory today, with its banking, has masked this edge of the steps. So we've lost them on this side underneath, so they'll still be preserved, but underneath the banking for that footpath. And this is an artist's impression of what it should look like when the work's complete. The aim is to add material to the existing surface rather than dig into fresh ground, because obviously if you're doing that, it meant that the steps could not have existed historically in the first place. So it's got to be material added to the existing slope in order to bring that back, and to put back the planting that would have accompanied the steps on either side as a flanking measure. And by improving the realm at the top by the Wolff statue, it will then not be possible for people to hop over and walk down the slope. So that option will be no more to do that. In addition to the steps and the other works I've already mentioned, there's works planned for the flower garden, the garden lake area, and the wildlife in the wilderness, as well as conduit head works will also be enhanced for visitor experience. In addition to this, we'll also be doing work at the Anglo-Saxon Cemetery, which is over on the western side of the park over here. Here, here's quite a nice view in low light of the remaining, a number of the remaining barrows. These are Saxon burial mounds. There's only about half a dozen surviving Saxon barrows, upstanding Saxon barrow cemeteries around the country. This was also scheduled in 2009, so it was not protected until then. Initially, there were something like 37 barrows identified within this group. And the first recording we have of the existence of this cemetery was in 1784, with them being identified in the volume on Kent history at that time. But we also then had at that same time 12 being excavated by the Reverend James Douglas, and you can see depressions in the top of a number of these where you can suggest that those were the barrows that he had targeted for excavations to look for evidence of their burials and their contents. We also then lost 12 barrows in the group as part of the initial site clearance that was envisaged for the creation of the water reservoir that's in fact sited further south than it was intended. But due to public outcry at the time, the work was stopped, so the rest of the cemetery was saved. Here's another aerial view. You can see more clearly those barrows that had been dug into by Reverend James. But in recent years, I've actually identified 2 lost barrows within the group. If you can make them out, you've got one here and a slightly smaller one next to it in this position. So clearly we need to go back at some point and carry out a more detailed geophysical study of this wider area to try and map out related archaeology to the main group as best we can. But as part of the Greenwich Park Revealed project, what we plan to do is to take out this footpath, take it back to the stump here and back to the stump here, and have information panels at the ends of those termini of the footpath. There is a good footpath that runs to the south if you want to use a footpath, but the idea is that people will be more inclined to perhaps meander around and look at the Barrow Cemetery rather than use it as a walkthrough as it is at the moment. So that will improve that, and a lot of this work will be done as a community project because it'd be a case of taking up the tarmac carefully, given that they truncate some of the barrows that we have in this particular part of the site. And for that, there will be an archaeological programme to do that. I'm pleased to say that the Royal Parks, as part of this programme, is in the process of appointing an archaeologist to their team, to oversee the capital works impact on archaeology, but also to run a full programme of community archaeological work around different parts of the park. So they will be very much involved with that. And the legacy of that post, I'm pleased to say, will be that that post will be retained by Royal Parks and be the in-house archaeologists across all their sites. So that's a really good legacy for us and for the Royal Parks. As I say, community projects have been a feature of Greenwich Park for a number of years. And in recent years, they've been managed by Keevil Heritage Limited. I'm grateful to Graham for managing that. We've been focused a lot on the former site of the Keeper's Cottage Lodge in the park. And so a lot of detailed work's been undertaken there. And you can see how close to the surface it is, but it does mean that we can actually pinpoint very precisely now where the buildings would have been, so that we can ensure that any future plans for this part of the park fully take account of the archaeological remains that we have for this area of the site. There's much we can study within the park which we don't understand. We have wartime anti-aircraft emplacement here. We have air raid shelters down here, but we also have over here archaeology of unknown origin. We've got this rectangular feature here. We've got these platform spaces here. What they're actually relating to, we don't know. Historically, there was a Roman sarcophagus found over on this side of the park. Whether this is Roman or something completely different, we've yet to discover, but that can easily be part of the community programme of work within Greenwich Park. And then in 2018, with the very dry summer we have the Greenwich Park always has the potential to surprise us, and it revealed this right-angled ditch and parallel ditch running through here and possibly returning there. In fact, this ditch you can possibly see running through into this part of the site here. So the year before lockdown, we did a small piece of community work, and we put 3 small trenches across these features, and they are clearly Roman in date. So we've clearly got some Roman enclosure of some description down on the bottom lower part of the park in front of the Queen's House area. So that is clearly an area which we will revisit in future years. So another site that you can, that the members of the society and other local people can have an active role in. And as part of the community work, we've had lots of very good support by local school groups coming to visit and having an archaeological experience. So moving quickly on, Greenwich Wolff is the next topic of discussion tonight. And the site is Greenwich Peninsula, and Greenwich Wolff is tucked right down here. I'll come back to this plan a little bit later on, but what it does this show is that we have a slightly lower depressed area running off from the Thames through this space here. This area has been heavily built up over many years, and so we looked at the geotechnical borehole records from the site. We supplemented it with geoarchaeological boreholes to look at the profiles of layers that existed across the site. Before we put down a series of evaluation trenches, stepped trenches. They had to be stepped because of the depth of excavation needing to be undertaken. We had to go down a long way, so the trenches had to be stepped for safety. But we put those evaluation trenches down. We recovered a lot of prehistoric archaeology in these areas. Before we then expanded the operation back to the blue line, which was the extent of the new basement for the buildings that were going to go onto this site. And it was during the ground stripping, which was done under archaeological supervision, that we discovered this medieval tide mill. You can see how low down it is compared with modern day. And we could expose most of it in one go. We had to do the last part a couple of years later because of timing issues. But what we had was this amazing ground floor plan of a medieval tidal mill. And basically what you have is your main building here, which was in essence like a cuckoo clock with stabilizers, if you can imagine that. That'll be the main structure. And then you've got a supporting structure on either side of this, of the water wheel itself, which is in this trough. And we had the lower part of the wheel surviving within the trough. And clearly the superstructure had been dismantled rather than being eroded away by the Thames. So it was only the ground timbers that had been left behind. And here in this bottom photograph, you can see the remaining part of the wheel. The paddles were fixed to the outside. You only had one wheel. You didn't have a pair of wheels with the paddles fixed between. You had one wheel with the paddles fixed to the outside, held onto the wheel by these pegs called starts. The curvature of the wheel told us that the wheel would have been 4.2 meters in diameter. So no small item. But what it did show us was that it was making use of the tidal flow both in and out, because there was a lake behind this location back here, which meant it was able to take advantage of water filling the pond behind, as well as the filling of the pond by the Thames at rising tide level. Dendro samples were taken from 3 of the key timbers, as well as other timbers as well, of course, but 3 came back with exactly the same date, to show that the main timbers at least were all felled in the summer of 1194, which is an amazing thing. So clearly those timbers had been selected from ancient woodland nearby, roughly worked, and then brought to a yard for finishing and rough fitting before being brought to site. What I can show you today is the plan of the layout. Here you have the main mill site. Here's the mill race channel at the back. Here's the trough with the mill wheel there, before going on to the race and tail race going out towards the Thames. This will also help us to inform what the water level was at that time in the Thames, which we don't really understand at this stage. So it would be a crucial site to work out how this fits into the sea level changes that have occurred through time. The post-excavation programme was moving on apace until COVID hit, but we don't have a new date for the completion of the post-ex. The post-ex for this site will obviously include a lot of research in France, because this would have been constructed under the behest of the Abbey of Ghent, who owned this land at that time. So a lot of work needs to be done in archives in France to help us fully understand this site and to understand its interpretation going forward. So once we're out of COVID and Museum of London Archaeology Service is able to reassess their post-ex programme, and obviously they've got a large backlog of work to do now, with work stalling over the past year, they will therefore hope to give us a new target date for the publication. Hopefully by the summer we'll have a date for that, and I'll let the members know what that is, but we're probably looking at another 18 months before we can see this one through, I suspect. Moving rapidly on, Greenwich Peninsula, an area of low-lying land which has been significantly built up over many years. Mary in the past has talked about the industrial heritage of this area, and you may recall we had the remains of a whale picked up here by pre-construct archaeology as part of the Stone Wolf development a few years back. But what I want to talk about is this large area of the peninsula, which was subject to a master plan. Master plan is a device that developers can use to put together a wide area scheme in basic detail, without all the nuts and bolts and details that you would expect for full application, but to give to get permission from the local planning authority of the type of development and scale of development and massing of development that they would like to see within this area. So this opportunity was taken to put together a scheme of addressing the archaeological potential of this site that is going to be buried a long way down, particularly. So the scheme we came up with was to write an archaeological brief whereby the whole site, which is divided into development plots, is assessed, and if we have enough information from those sites, we can then say whether any of those sites have no potential, in which case we can write them off, or we are lacking information, so we need to undertake further work so that we can get to a position of saying that there's no archaeological potential remaining, or if there is, move on to evaluation and potentially excavation or preservation for those plots that do remain. So this is the way the site's been divided up, and this is slightly out of date now, but it shows the plots that we've been able to say has no further potential, areas which have more information is required to enable us to make a judgment, and other sites which clearly have ongoing archaeological potential, so we can focus our efforts and developers can move forward with confidence to know that those sites have potential, whereas sites down here have no potential, so they can work out when they need to engage with archaeology. Two different companies have modelled the buried deposits across this space, but they are broadly similar. What they show is we have a former channel coming across the bottom of the peninsula, and another channel snaking its way down through the middle of the site, coming down through here. What they do both show is an area of relatively higher ground in this area, which matches that of the areas of ongoing archaeological potential. So there we have potential for Neolithic and Bronze Age archaeology to occur in situ there. So that is something that has yet to come through. Moving on swiftly, I won't go into huge detail on this because obviously this was the subject of the talk 3 years ago. But just to mention for those who weren't able to attend that particular presentation, we have the area. This is the Thames is off to the left on this one, so north is to the left. We have the hurriedly built gun emplacement here, which was thrown up as a defence for London against the Dutch, hurriedly built in 1668 to stop the fleet coming up to sack London, as was thought at the time. But it's rapidly gained use after that time for the storage of munitions and surplus guns. Higher dry ground is to the bottom of the picture here, and marshier ground extends in eastwards or to the top of this picture. So this area was available for use in that particular way. Picture round the right way now, you can see the fort, but you can also see how the arsenal site is starting to develop, with more facilities being brought to the site and developed. And then by the time we get into the Napoleonic period, we see massive store buildings being created, timber carriage department being built. We also have Pilkington Canal coming in to bring in supplies into the heart of the site. We've also got proofing butts where they are testing cannon that's being made on site. They're testing cannon in this area. In the end, in the mid-Victorian period, the whole area is a sea of workshops, a massive industrial site. The site was divided into departments, and you can see we've got gun factory, laboratories, stores, carriage department, as well as residential and ammunition works. And you can see we've been able to locate the Prince Rupert's Fort, so we can actually draw that in on this plan. And you can see the moat for the triangular fort not only would have been supplied from the Thames, but it also was fed by this stream that ran south through the site in that location. The site carried on expanding, so that by 1864 the ranges are getting bigger because the guns are getting bigger that they're manufacturing and need bigger ranges to test. So it's by 1907 that the site reaches its maximum scale with chemical filling, shell filling stations dotted around the site, but also extensive test ranges extending out into the marshland. And the main entrance into and out of the site was through the Beresford Gate. At its height, 80,000 people would have worked at this site, but the entrance to the site was divorced from the rest of the site in 1984 with the creation of the dual carriageway between it and the rest of the factory site, and divided therefore the arsenal from the Woolwich town centre ever since. This part in blue is the area that's been raised with made ground for the buildings to be built onto that former marshland area, and convict hulks were moored off Woolwich to provide the labour to do all this work. And you can see that there's the stream running south through the site there. But it was not until we did the work for the Crossrail station that we was able to absolutely, for the first time, I'd see this stream for the first time. So that was an important thing to achieve. But this is the map of the archaeology that was revealed during the archaeological clearance before the main excavation occurred. So there's some of the officers' buildings that was being recorded before, and the patent office before deeper excavations were conducted. And here's the excavations carrying on apace. Archaeologists working down in this location on this face down here. And there's a view just to show the size of the excavated station once it was done. It was big enough, the station box, to take number 1 Canary Wharf line down. That's the size of that station. And that's where the trains would have come through there. But what this excavation did show us, as I say, is this stream. And here's the slowly silted infill of that stream through this space here, which we was able to see here. And within that, within the space of that stream, we recovered 2 piles, the dating of which is quite broad, but the central date matches pretty closely that of the Prince Rupert's Fault. So maybe there's a small bridge across the stream that was constructed at the same time as Prince Rupert's Fault was constructed to aid mobility. To the west of the Arsenal site, we have an important area or development that's now part of the Royal Arsenal regeneration work, and therefore as archaeological works expanded with it. This area is important because it's the first time after leaving Erith down here that you can reach open water without having to cross marsh. So this is a very important location at Woolwich for that to happen. So here's an early map showing the Elizabethan rope yard that was built. Here's the Royal Arsenal, the Warren site here. The docks are over to the west up this space. So you've got an important area in between. And this area of ground revealed a number of medieval pottery kilns. And here's just one of the kilns that we excavated. And then you can see remains of an earlier kiln below it. From within this, a lot of pottery waster material was recovered. So as a discrete group, that's quite valuable to have to show that all these forms were in production at once. So that was part of the ongoing work for the site. We also uncovered this large ditch that's running from left to right. It's having to be stepped sectioned because of the depth of the feature itself. You can see there's the bottom there, and this is the top of it up here. And using a special dating technique, meaning that you can actually date the soil, we've been able to determine that the feature would have been dug in the mid to late Iron Age. So a massive ditch being dug against the river, and we've now sectioned this feature in 3 places. So you can actually plot the line of that massive ditch running around here. We've not found an entrance to it yet, but it's clearly marking out this area of high ground against the river as being particularly important. So clearly there's got to be an entrance somewhere through here, and therefore roads relating to that to get in and out. We also found behind Tower Place, which was to the immediate west of Prince Rupert's Fault, built in that area there, was actually preceded by an earlier manorial building, and you can see remains of the oven floor here, and an excavated cesspit guardrobe here, and remnants of earlier buildings being patched and repatched and built and rebuilt and reused and recycled and added to and changed over many, many years. So there's at least 10 phases of construction within this one particular part of the building there. So there's a lot of work to be done to unpick all that. And then as part of the dance with the developers to hand over more plot by plot of an area of development, once the archaeology has been cleared, we were left with this area of this particular site, where we actually uncovered which we had not expected, a late 7th to early 8th century Saxon cemetery. And you can see burials on top of other burials. You've got this burial here, and you can see the jawbone of another individual lower down here. And you've got others side by side, but different heights, all chopped through by later industrial development. So we only had fragmentary remains, but we had 77 individuals, men, women and children represented within this group. And it turns out that these burials have survived because they were in the location of this wide street, Rodney Street. Any cemetery that was to the north or to the south of that street had been lost. So we only had the burials that survived where the street would have originally stood. So that, tying together the later maps, you can start to interpret what survival we had, why the survival was as it was. So here's just a general view of, sorry about the graininess of this one, of the Georgian street layout. You can see the buildings, here's the street. So we're actually picking up the details of the earlier buildings on the site. We also lifted the floors so that we could identify any earlier archaeology that had been truncated by the excavation of these basements. We also had the kitchen sink in this one, surviving against, popped up against here. So underneath industrial buildings, where you think, oh, there's not going to be any archaeology surviving there, you can end up with a detailed picture looking like that once you clear it back. But we also found odd, bizarre things such as this down here. In this location, we had a single pit. The central fill would be in black soil to show whether a post had rotted in position, packed with lumps to hold it in position of lumps of painted plaster, Roman plaster. There was quite a number of bronze brooches in with it as well, and underneath the base of the post were a number of silver Roman coins as well as part of the dedication of that post. So what is that post telling us? You can see the example cross-section of that feature here. As I say, this location is the area where you can reach open water without going through marsh. And if you look north of the river, there is a Roman road running down through Newham that's not going towards London or to Colchester or anywhere like that. It's running straight to the Thames. And the marsh, the water would have got up to around about this location. So somewhere in this area of Newham, there must be a site not too dissimilar to our Woolwich site. Whether we'll ever find that is another story, but it's likely that there would have been a river crossing point from Woolwich. So there's been a ferry of some description at Woolwich a lot longer than we perhaps initially thought. Because that post could actually be a signalling post to signal the other side of the river to call the boat. I must mention this exemplary publication by Peter Guillory. I have to say, I would still say exemplary even if Peter Guillory wasn't with us tonight, but welcome Peter to this presentation, who gives a very good detailed history of the Woolwich Arsenal and the parish of Woolwich. But I'm now pleased to say that we are pretty close to having an agreement with the developers for the funding of the full funding and post-excavation and publication of the 22 years of archaeological work that's been undertaken within this site. What we'll still need to see for planning is a post-ex and publication framework document submitted to the council, which will give the content of how the post-ex and publication will actually be achieved. We're looking at 2 volumes, one which will focus on the Arsenal related archaeology, and the second one focusing on the pre-Arsenal archaeology. So clearly the emphasis will be weighted with one area or the other area, but obviously we have Roman archaeology, particularly within the Arsenal site, which will go into the Teardrop and Riverside volume. So we're very close to achieving that. We should see that being agreed later this year. And then within the next 4 years, we will then get the publications finally of all this work at the Royal Arsenal. So that is a piece of good news we can have. Moving on quickly, I see we're on rapid time here. So these are very short presentations coming up. These are things to happen. So watch this space is basically what I'm looking at here. Macbean Street, this large development outlined in red. Here's the line I've put on here showing you roughly where that large late Iron Age ditch should be. If there's going to be an entranceway, it's got to be somewhere around here. And therefore, there's going to be a path, a road running through this space. So it's quite possible that there is a late Iron Age track that becomes Romanized that may actually pass through this site. And if you've got a road running outside of an enclosure, what roadside activity might you recover from this site from either side of the road if we do have the road? So there's a lot of potential there. There's also potential for more medieval kiln industry in this area. This is the site as it looks now, not very pretty. It's all this open area here. So we will be looking at this in the next over the next year. This will be starting to move on a gear, and obviously, community archaeology is part of the wider consideration, and so there will be information provided about what is actually happening and when about this site. The next stage will be evaluation, trial trenching, to determine what the second stage of archaeological site work will need to be. But I can assure you archaeology will not be forgotten in respect to this scheme. It's being undertaken by condition. So I'll just show you roughly where you are. You're next to the rope yard area. It's all this former property. There was a smithy within the site, so we may get evidence of that. You never know, it may even be a bell foundry. We might have a bell foundry in Woolwich, even if not in Greenwich. So watch this space. And also there's obviously the Woolwich Polytechnic was within this site as well. I'm sure some of you may recall, as well as a drill hall. Spray Street. This has been very much in the public mind of late. Here's an aerial view, divided two sites. Within the main site, we've got obviously the covered market square here. This is showing you where the site sits. Initially, it was apparently on open ground. This plan is from 1842, and you can see that part of the site did include a chapel in this area, and there's also a marker stone recorded where the boundary between the two political areas changes course. So clearly there's an important stone marker initially there. The origins of that marker not yet known. So that's where the stone would be. There's the chapel building within the site, and there we go. There's lecture rooms and so on there. And then later on, of course, we have the covered market being built. A unique structure in many ways, because it's very much a First World War type timber construction for aircraft hangars. But this one was clearly built solely for domestic use, for civil use. So an important feature that was listed grade 2 in 2018, so that has to remain within this wider regeneration of this site. So here's the cover market. These were the other listed buildings within the area. They've now undertaken a level 1 building recording program of all the buildings within the development area, and that will help identify which buildings require a higher level of recording. So that's an initial pilot, if you like, to ascertain what level of recording needs to be achieved across all these buildings before they are touched. And the guidance for that approach is given within our guidance documentation, Understanding Historic Buildings. You can find a lot more detail about this approach in there. Going back to the archaeology, again, if we have the Roman road running through, we haven't had it within the Arsenal site, it's quite possibly going to come through this site as well. And this is the road that would go on to as Wattling Street, heading down into Kent. So we may have more Roman archaeology occurring within this area, apart from having the interesting building estate to look at. So far, only geotechnical data has been provided from the site. We've yet to undertake any archaeological evaluation at all yet. So I'll keep you abreast as to how and when that happens. And that will inform what more extensive archaeological works need to occur within certain areas of the site thereafter. And of course, we won't be forgetting the footprint of the covered market, because clearly works will need to be undertaken within that space. And so we need to look at the archaeology within that from the earlier dates, particularly the chapel, see what's happening there. But more importantly, in some ways, this is the projected line of that channel that runs through. That's also the line of the parish boundary. And clearly that feature, that parish boundary would have been set in the Saxon period and the late Saxon period. So it was an important feature at that time, and probably from an earlier date as well. So that there is potential for Roman, Saxon archaeology and medieval archaeology, all within this particular area of the site, maybe further off to one side, along its margins. But there's also potential for waterlogged archaeology, potentially in certain areas of this site as well. So everything to play for within this site. Moving on to Petman Crescent, we have the area of marshland, of Plumstead Marsh and Erith Marsh. We're looking at the western side of this. Royal Arsenal East was 66 buildings run by the MOD, all recorded before demolition. There's Belmarsh Prison in the background. This was going to be cleared for Juvenile Detention Centre, and this was used by researchers after the Second World War, and this is where the British contingent who had taken part in the Oppenheim project in the atomic bomb research in America. This is where they came back and worked. So it's an important part of British history in that respect. So this is the site down here. If we look at the buried topography from the geotechnical and borehole logs that we've got scattered from all around this area, you can see that it's on rising ground within that buried landscape. We did a lot of geotechnical work and geoarchaeological borehole work within this area to model the landscape before putting in these lines of boreholes to give us a cross section through the site to inform where to put our two trenches that we had. Because of the depth involved, we had to put all our eggs into two baskets to deal with the archaeology in this space. And so this is the modelling that we used. We were on the edge of this channel space here to put those trenches, and this is what they look like on site. And you can see the layering complexity of materials being eroded and deposited in the channel space. But we did find two layers of Bronze Age platform, as well as the earliest platform in London, the Neolithic platform, made of these split timbers down here. Timbers split and then laid in pairs to make a platform. The consistency of cardboard, I'm afraid, so there was no possible way of lifting these things. But the dating is quite clear that they're Neolithic in date at the bottom of the peat level. This timber up here shows Neolithic Bronze Age axe marks on the end of this felled tree that we had on one edge of the site. Crossrail, a lot of work done in respect of that, and where you have streams running off the higher ground towards the Thames, at each of those stream crossings of the Crossrail section, we were having in situ Bronze Age woodwork surviving, stakes as well as laid material. You can see timber laid here. So potential for Bronze Age archaeology is very high in that area. Petman Crescent, take two, is this area here. We're at the early stages of this site. This is the Juvenile Detention Centre here that we've just been looking at. So high potential for archaeology here. Last year, we did a lot of work predetermination because of the high potential for archaeology from the next site, showing that we might get archaeology of that level occurring here. We did a lot of geoarchaeological survey work, as well as some test pits across the site to give us enough information to say that we can deal with the archaeology by condition rather than having to do more work, predetermination, because clearly the more work that's done predetermination is more expensive for the developer without the security of knowing they've got permission to build. So it's all at risk for the developer to do that. So we're very grateful that we was able to achieve all that before planning permission was granted. So that's the early work. This is showing the channel where we had the archaeology running through into our site, with the very high ground down in this part of the area. So you will be seeing very soon another geoarchaeological rig appearing on site, because we'll be doing a series of transects across this channel, as we now understand it to be, across the whole of this site, so that we can then start working out where to put the next series of archaeological interventions to try and pick up any in situ archaeology that survives within this area, and understand our prehistoric routes for Plumstead in this area. You can see the building blocks planned across this site, and obviously we're now looking at other developments that are coming through for in the planning process for the neighbouring areas of this site. So this area is starting to expand further eastwards with equal potential. And then finally, just coming out to their time, just to briefly mention that this site is on the western edge of the Plumstead Marsh area, but there is a whole area of regeneration being planned for the Thamesmead zone. And if we look at the buried topography, we can see that we've got high spots within that landscape. Not very high, but there are high spots in there. And you can see our earlier sites on the edge of this landscape. And we can therefore expect islands of archaeology within that landscape. So predicting and working out where those are and dealing with them is important. But we have the Thamesmead and Abbeywood OAPF. OAPF is the Opportunity Area Planning Framework, which is a Mayor of London scheme to kickstart regeneration in particular zones around London. And I think there are about 37 of these, or 41 of these zones already. This one is divided 65-35 between two boroughs. So it's a huge area. And so the idea is to have an archaeological approach that is consistent and follows a framework whereby we can focus everybody's energies where required. In December last year, the Mayor adopted his plan for this opportunity area, and I'm pleased to say that I was able to contribute to this, and able to offer wording and phrases and texts to be added into that, including the need to undertake archaeology as part of this structured approach. I won't go into huge detail about the policies, but also you can find that on the Mayor of London's website in detail. But basically, It's a very high-level strategy document, the opportunity growth areas, and it sits above all borough plans, borough local plans, and above supplementary planning guidance, etc., etc., which is the level at which another thing called archaeological priority areas sits, but obviously that's another talk another day. So it's a very high-level strategy document, and this is underpinned by research which I was able to contribute to for this volume here, that also then fed it into the national guidance on modelling for archaeology for buried deposits. So in three last slides, just to quickly outline how the archaeological framework will work. The board will consist of the two planning authorities and Historic England. I will write the brief for them, and the boroughs will have condition wording that will make reference to this framework, so that it's then locked into the planning process that way. They will appoint a consultant who will produce a detailed deposit model for the whole area and take on board the results of specific sites work as part of a rolling 5-year cycle of reporting and publication of that data, while the individual sites are investigated in the usual way, but only taken as part of their conditioned work to a summary statement level, with the information being provided up to the consultant for area-wide publication rather than site-by-site keyhole publication. So I'm in the process of writing the brief in response to the Mayor's document, and that should be finished by the end of this month. Once it's been accepted by the Mayor's office, then I'll happily share that document with the members. But this programme, once it's approved, it will then last for the next 20 years. So that's the life of the OAPF for this area. So this framework has to work correctly because it's going to be in place for the next 20 years, longer than I'll be remaining in post, I'm sure. So that's the quick whistle-stop tour in 1 hour, 8 minutes. Apologies for being over the hour. If you want to email me after today, because like you, I will often think of things later on that I wish I'd asked. So please do email me. Or I'm very lonely on Twitter. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's my handle, Southern London. So thank you for your time this evening. I hope you found it interesting. But there are plenty of sites that are important to Woolwich and to Plumstead, which are going to be coming along, as well as Greenwich Park. They'll be looking for your support in the coming years ahead. So once COVID is over, there's plenty for you to get your teeth into. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was great. I really enjoyed that. That was fantastic. And as someone who's lived in this area for getting on for half a century, my first job was in Calderwood Street in Woolwich, and when the Arsenal was behind that big high wall and nobody would come in and would see what was going on inside. It was really fascinating to hear. Questions. If you want to ask questions, if you move your mouse down to the middle bottom of the screen, you'll see something saying chat, where you can type in a question in the bottom in the window. So we've had quite a lot through this whole thing, so I can read some out, and I've got some. Start with Greenwich. I just remember the excitement of my kids who were at All Saints School in 1999 and came back from school one day saying, "Town team's in the park, it's wonderful." It was great, and we were great town team fans on Sunday afternoons. One of the things that they did then, one of the members of the team, was that try to identify the site of Wattling Street across the park. Is it there, or is this just a myth?
Well, the thinking is that it's actually to the south of the park. But if you
basically where the A2 is, you mean?
Yeah, but if you're heading west along Wattling Street, coming through Shooters Hill and so on,
yeah,
if you're looking straight ahead, you would have seen the temple.
Right.
before your road
Yeah.
turned left, as it were. But
Yeah.
you could continue on the access path to the temple.
Right. So there would have been a small pathway or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
Branching off.
yeah, but you would have seen it as you headed west along Wattling Street. You would have seen it ahead of you,
Yeah.
and then at the last moment, the road would take you off to the left,
Onto dry land or staying on dry land.
just on the higher ground as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because obviously on higher ground, it's not likely to be seasonally muddy along there than it would be if you went down onto the lower ground.
You mentioned lots of opportunities for community archaeology once COVID is over. Who do they need to talk to? Is that you or is that someone else?
I'm happy to pass information on to who's ever doing the work. I endeavour to let local societies know within a particular borough when site work is due to start within their patch, with details of what's coming along. But in terms of the Petman Crescent site, the current site that's happening, we do have, once it appears on the decision notice, a specific community engagement condition, not just wrapped into the archaeology condition, a standalone condition for community engagement, and that therefore requires the community engagement framework to be presented and approved before development works start. So there's got to be a kind of coherent program of public engagement that's been compiled and agreed and understood before the site starts. So these sort of sites invariably are not conducive for public to wander onto for obvious reasons. Yeah. But these days there's many opportunities to inform people, whether it be via people's websites, via Twitter, through daily diaries from people working on site, to doing specific podcasts and other media things of that sort, as well as usual things such as press releases and so on and so forth. So there's a whole range of options, and I've put together a spreadsheet of all the permutations that you would have for physically on-site things, whether you've got peepholes and billboards, or viewing platforms or whatever, through to remote engagement during the work, as well as engagement after the work. And then you work through that to identify which of those options are viable or reasonable or appropriate for your site. So you end up with a shopping list of things that you know that you can achieve. So that's what's been put in place for that site, and that's happening more and more, because clearly there has to be a clear demonstration of public value in pretty much everything we do, and it's not just for altruistic reasons. We're asking planners to put on conditions which will then cost developers to achieve. These things have to be measured, because at the bottom line is that if one of my sites went to public inquiry and the planning inspector said, why did you decide to do this or do that, I need to justify what I do. So all the decisions that we make, we hope, are reasonable, proportionate and appropriate. And that's always behind everything that we do. So certainly public engagement is going to be a key thing on many of these sites, particularly around Woolwich and Plumstead, that are coming up in the next couple of years.
Obviously, yes. Let me ask some questions that people have been posting. Colin says, do you feel that the Mayor's OPF for Plumstead Marshes is short-sighted in relation to climate change when considering historical outlying water levels, channels and so on?
Obviously, there's use that can be made of tidal work. Obviously, it's also an extremely low-lying flat land as well, so there's opportunity for wind. But in terms of the non-archaeological elements of the Mayor's scheme, or even the developer's 35-storey tower block they want to build. I have no comment possible to make in respect to those aspects. My sole comment as Historic England archaeology advisor is to advise on archaeological related matters. So I can't, even though personally I'd have clear comment I could make about environmental issues on the mayor's scheme or developer schemes, or the colour of the building or the design of a building. That's not part of my remit, alas, or perhaps it's probably a good idea that it's not part of my remit.
Yeah.
But my remit is just to deal with the archaeology, I'm afraid.
Let me go through some others. Tonya says, is there a link through Greenwich and Woolwich to the Bronze Age trackway which runs through Erith?
Sorry, what was the actual question itself?
Sorry, is there a link through the Greenwich Woolwich link to the Bronze Age trackway which runs through Erith? Anything about
it's quite a long way. It'd be quite a long way. There's probably, if it's like anything like the area on the north side of the River Thames, in the lower estuary area, if it's anything like that, what we might have are a series of family groups or village groups having access to slices of landscape from higher dry ground down to open water through the marsh, and therefore trackways are going to be predominantly going from north-south, south-north, in that sort of way, rather than trying to go all the way along. Because you've got your own zone of resource that you're utilising, and then you've got your neighbour next door doing the same thing on their bit of high ground, marshland, open water. So you're trying to connect up the higher islands, seasonal islands, for summer grazing or hunting or fishing or whatever. It may be that at certain times there may be an occupation actually undertaken within these areas rather than just being seasonal, as part of an actual way of defending your area, your building. So it's more like they're more likely to be roughly north-south, their trackways, but they can also be east-west if you're trying to hop to the small island next door, to your main route.
Carol says, what do you know about the reservoirs in Greenwich Park? She's been hearing about them.
Well, we've got various conduits which run down through Greenwich Park that's fed water to the royal palaces, and there is more work to be done to map those locations. There are videos on the internet which show people exploring certain
indeed, yes, I've seen some of them.
Probably not a good idea on your own to do that sort of thing, but there's clearly more work to be done to map those, and obviously looking at the conduit heads that are in the park, making those more accessible to the public and interpreted for the public as well, is important, and that's definitely part of the Greenwich Park Revealed programme. But certainly, the Royal Parks are very keen to understand a lot more about these conduits and where they are within the park for obvious reasons. But just as part of the chapter in the story of Greenwich Park, is important that we understand more about that.
Joan, who happens to be my wife, who's downstairs, she says,
Hi, Joan.
What's going to be preserved? Are the tide mill and other things going to be preserved and visible, or are they going to be built over?
Well, we had a problem. We had a problem at the time of the excavation, in that there are only two places in the country that have the facilities to do what we call freeze-dry timbers of that size. The obvious one is the Mary Rose Trust,
yes, of course,
down on the south coast, and the other centre is up at York. And they have very limited capacity because obviously there's such high demand. So we had to be selective in what we had preserved, and we were looking very much at key elements of the tide mill that were critical to the interpretation. So we kept elements of it, whereas to try and keep all those massive timbers was not feasible. We did explore other options where you've got these parks where historic buildings go when they retire. But we did explore things like that as an option where it could potentially go. But being able to conserve it was the biggest headache that we did try and explore. We did explore a lot of avenues to try and sort that out. But the tide mill is interesting also because we're keeping samples because of that. 1194 is at the crossroads between what had been timber working, where you peg peg timbers together and to make your structures, and actually carve joints.
Right.
Put timbers together that way. So it's the interface between woodwork and carpentry.
Right.
And you've got both examples on this one structure. So technologically, it's very important. So there's a huge variety of topics that will be explored in the publication when it appears. Because, as I say, it's all been kicked back because of, unfortunately, COVID at the moment. But once we get a date, I will certainly let members know that.
Great. We have an apology from Colin. He says he feels sad that as a child he rode his BMX bike over the Saxon barrows. Well, yes, I can quite understand, and I hope there'll be no more of that, please.
Well, hopefully, as a penance, he can be on the team to help lift the path.
Yes. Colin also says, he just posted, are you and English Heritage aware of the tunnels under Vanbrugh Castle? 2 entrances located in the woodlands behind the building, both brick-lined. And Vanbrugh Castle was to the east of the park, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. No, I'm not aware of that, no.
All right, okay. Colin, can you follow up Mark's email and at the end of his presentation and contact him and let him know? Mary Mills says, she says, one of the terrible quality of some desktops. But as you know, I must draw attention to sites on the peninsula now wrecked by developers which are not properly investigated, despite the 19th century structures being on the OS and tithe maps. Would you ask if your people investigating the 12th century tide mill will include reviews of research already done on the Ghent papers?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we won't be reinventing the wheel in terms of the research done, but obviously we're picking up available information, as well as filling in the gaps in terms of the specific research that's being done. But it's clearly Museum of London Archaeology will be on the ball on that. But obviously I will remind them of that. Thank you, Mary, for reminding me.
Yes, I hope you're happy with that, Mary. Yes. I think it's sort of running out of questions. That's good. But why did you say you want to investigate France for Ghent? Because Ghent has been Belgium. Was it part of France back in the 1194?
I believe it was, but I will need to go off and check now, won't I?
Okay, right, yes. It's one of those bits that have moved backwards and forwards ever since.
Yeah.
Until the Treaty of Vienna, I guess, it all got settled until Belgium divides again. Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Mark Stevenson from Historic England. I've really enjoyed this. We've covered the Iron Age, we've covered the Romans, we've covered the medieval times, the tide mill, 1194. And it's been a great, and I never knew there was quite so much involved. And I say I've lived in this area for nearly half a century and worked here back in the 70s and 80s in Woolwich, and never knew there was quite so much. Of course, in those days we couldn't get into the arsenal, so we had no idea what was behind that big wall. It would probably have shot me if I'd tried to get in. Mary says she can send info on the Vanbrugh Castle tunnels. So she wants to say something about the developer and the tide mill. Mary, would you like to have a...
Yeah, I was only going to say, which people from English Heritage may not be aware of, that when the first tranche of the 12th century tide mill, as distinct from the 18th century tide mill, the 12th century tide mill was done, I tried to get the developers to put a signage up with some information. And
Oh, hold on, we've got a problem here.
they
Andrea,
refused
can you
on the
mute your mic,
grounds.
please? Mary, can you say that again?
They refused on the grounds that they couldn't afford to put a poster up.
Yeah. Right. We had to be strict with developers. Yeah.
I mean, a lot. Some of my time is often spent
Yeah, I know.
ensuring that planning conditions are followed through on different sites and correctly interpreted, and the post-excavation actually happens. So some of these sites may only occur in the field for within a few months, but has involved several years of work prior to that, and then many years, unfortunately, after the excavation to see it through. So there's a lot of project work that is now historic, that is still being pursued through planning requirements.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. It's now 9:05, so we've had an hour and 35 minutes of Mark's time. I'm really grateful. Thank you very much. And at least you don't have to go and get a damp, cold train from Blackheath Station back to Bedford tonight. So thank you very much indeed, Mark. This will be on our YouTube channel probably by the weekend. Takes quite a bit of editing and fiddling around. And don't forget our next event, which is on, I think, the 12th, but we'll put it on our Facebook group. That's looking at the Hatcham Iron Works and its engine working. And that's Father Kevin Robinson from the Roman Catholic Church in the area. He's a great fan of that, done a lot of work on that. So he's going to be talking about that. And you can see some of the engines on the Festiniog Railway once we can go and travel around and move again. So, and you're not allowed in Wales anyway at the moment because, anyway, I will stop at that point. And I'll say thank you very much indeed, Mark. That's been great. Mary, do you want to have a final word to say thank you to Mark, and thank you?
Yes, I'm going to thank you, Mark. I mean, knew we had a lot to get through actually, and that was all very interesting about the park. I will come back to you on, I think, probably the Siemens site, which, obviously, and some other sites, which I know that there is work ongoing. And I'll try and put something on the Facebook page as and when I get some information. Okay, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. While you're talking about the Siemens site in Charlton/Woolwich, and nobody seems to be quite agreed which one it is, the cable depot that I showed in my talk back in October, which was a post office for which British Telecom stores right next to the Siemens site, that's now been turned into an art centre, and Victoria Vance, who is a local artist, has got an installation going on there. It's going to be open by booking only to the public on, I think, the 12th of April. But if you go cable-depot.com, you will find all about it. And Victoria has got an art installation there, as I say. There will be other things going on. It's now a proper art site. So go and look at cable-depot.com and you can experience some industrial archaeology in situ, but turned into art. And they found a big reel of cable there. And Victoria asked me what they should do with it. And I said, just use it as an installation, Victoria. It's, it's part of the heritage of the building. So you should be able to see it propped up against the wall. But at that point, I'm going to say thank you very much, Mark. Thank you and good night. We've kept you a long time. So thank you. We're really grateful. It's been a great talk. I've learned a lot about this area that I've lived in for half a century, and I'm sure a lot of the rest of us have. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.